Hello, 7th graders. This is Mr. Chamberlain here, and I'm going to go through Chapter 5, Part 1 that we had you read, and if you were gone or need a refresher, this is all the information we'll need. So this chapter is about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. You read that in the 1800s he sailed all over, and one of the places that he went to was the Galapagos Islands. Most people have a picture of him that looks like this, but he's actually was much younger at the time when he did it. And when he was in the Galapagos Islands, he made a bunch of different observations that led him to come up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. So it's important to understand that the full name of this theory of evolution is that it includes by natural selection, because the natural selection part is what makes the difference. So the Galapagos Islands are located about 1,000 miles off the coast of South America, up there in that little red box, and they're very deserted little islands. There are lots of animals living on there, but not a lot of people live over there. They were formed in the same way that the Hawaiian Islands were formed, in that as the bottom of the ocean spreads really slowly in one direction, little pockets of magma come up, and as those pockets get closer and closer to land, they build and build until they become actual islands. But they're pretty flat, and they're made of all volcanic rocks. When he was there, he saw a lot of different things, some of which we've already kind of talked about in class. The first thing he noticed was that there was a large variety of the same kind of animals living there. So he saw many, many different finches, and some of the finches he saw on these islands had big, broad beaks, and some had small, pointy beaks. Some were really good at getting into nuts, some were really good at eating bugs, and others yet were good at breaking open things, getting inside of them. The weird thing was, though, that they were all finches, and even though they only lived a little bit away from each other, all of these different finches were on all of the separate islands. He thought that was kind of unusual, because the islands are not very big, separating each one. Another thing that he saw was that there were many different kinds of fossils. So we already know a fossil is something is dead, and that an impression of its body is left in the ground. And not a lot of things become fossils, but those things that do become fossils do a really good job of telling us what animals look like in the past. The biggest thing he probably noticed, though, were that the tortoises on each of the islands looked very different depending on which island you were on. In fact, the people that lived on the islands could tell where they were based on the turtle shell that they saw. So some islands had turtle shells with really big arches that came up on top that might have be good for letting the turtle stretch its neck up. Other ones had little spikes on them, almost in different shapes. So he didn't quite understand why they would look so different, each of their shells, and yet still be the same, pretty much the same exact species. Another animal that he noticed were iguanas. You see this is a normal iguana, and this is a marine iguana. The ones in the Galapagos were marine iguanas, and they had less spikes. Their skin was rougher and built for underwater. Their mouths had teeth that were less sharp, and their skin was a different color. And marine iguanas mostly get their food underwater, so these guys could swim, whereas these iguanas that we normally associate with rainforests and things like that don't ever go in the water if they can help it. So what he thought was so strange is that he saw different iguanas that were basically the same, except they had small changes to them. Different tortoises, plants, birds, many other creatures. They lived on islands, so he figured they had to have different experiences than mainland versions. So perfect example was this iguana. Iguanas that live in the rainforest don't need to know how to swim. They should be the same color as the rainforest, right? So green, and they should have extra little defenses for things attacking them, these little claws and spikes on their bodies. The marine iguanas, which live in an island thing, don't need to have the same traits about them. They can be a darker color, maybe more matching with the sand or the water. They need to have skin that's better watertight so that they can swim under there, and their mouths need to be able to eat a different kind of food. That's some of the ways that living on an island would be different than on the mainland for an iguana, but you can think of plenty of reasons for people too. So all of this he kind of put together, and he realized that what made animals different from each other is that they have different characteristics that help them adapt to where they live. So for example, this praying mantis probably lives in a very tropical rainforest-like place. It would make sense that it lives somewhere with colorful flowers, probably a lot of greens and leaves. If this praying mantis lived in Antarctica, besides the fact that it's really cold, it wouldn't be very successful. He noticed that all of these differences of all these animals on different islands, they each had their own adaptations to make them more suited for the specific spot they lived. And he realized that all of these species, we talked about all the different types of praying mantids, they probably changed how they look to make them better suited, better adapted to where they live over a really long time. And that's what evolution is. If you take really small changes in how this guy looks over a really, really long time until it's something completely different, a whole new species, then it's evolved. It's changed from what it once was into something new. But the key is that it takes a very long time to do this. So not a good example of evolution would be pet dogs, because believe it or not, all of these different dogs are all the ancestor of just a gray timber wolf. And even though a dachshund doesn't look anything like a timber wolf, wolves were taken by people and domesticated. And when they were domesticated, people wanted to only keep the baby wolves that were friendlier. You wouldn't want to keep a more wild animal. So slowly, dogs, wild wolves started taking on characteristics of domesticated dogs. They got smaller. They got cuter, I guess you could say. Their legs got shorter, because with shorter legs, you wouldn't have to depend on running around so much. Their tails got shorter, and they started to look any way they wanted. In fact, the reason we have things like poodles is because people said they wanted to have a dog that had white, fluffy fur. So they would only breed wolves that had closer to white hair and then closer to fluffy and furry, instead of sort of the tough kind of fur that wolves have. A better example would be something like this. In the fossil record about 55 million years ago, they found fossils of these little creatures about the size of a small, medium-sized dog that had many of the same traits as a horse. It had most of the same toes. A lot of the bones are in the same places. And then later, in a different part of the world that they figured was about 40 million years old, they found things that looked a whole lot like this guy, except they were slightly bigger, slightly longer necks, and their tails were fluffier and brought down. It would make sense then that these, to be more successful, would slowly start to look more like what horses look like today. A longer neck could be better for reaching food. Longer legs could be better for running away from things or from just running to get food. And the same thing happened. There's records of all these animals in history that start to look more and more like modern animals. So the ancestor of a modern horse was a completely different species. This species evolved or changed a little bit slowly over time to make it better suited for where it lives. It adapted. To be successful, it needed to be bigger to get more food easily. It needed to have longer legs to be able to run faster, and it needed to get rid of this little camouflage here, because maybe it didn't live in a place that needed to be camouflaged. Darwin figured that some animals are born slightly different. They have a variation that makes them more likely to survive. These birds didn't always used to have big, round, spoon bills. They used to probably be more normal, but babies that had, or offspring that had a slightly rounder one, probably had a better chance of catching insects in its mouth, or plant, or whatever this guy eats. And so they'd be more likely to have babies. If instead they had a beak that was less round and maybe more pointed, it might be harder to get the kind of food it wants and less likely to have babies. The ones that are more successful will have more babies with slightly rounder bills, and the same process continues. Maybe there's a couple of babies that have even rounder until they get something just right for them, a roundish spoon shape that's perfect for snatching and squishing bugs as food. The game we played yesterday proved that with our bird beaks. So in conclusion, and this is just the first day talking about it, little changes or variations in an animal either makes it more likely to survive or less likely to survive. So in this case, some beetles are brown and some beetles are green. If they both live on a tree trunk, the ones that are brown blend in better. than the ones that are green. Therefore, the ones that are green are probably more likely to get eaten if they live on the bark, which is why later in history, there's probably going to be more of them that are going to be brown. I hope that made more sense to you, or you got a good idea of what we talked about in class.